The Morton farm sat on the outermost bend of the township, where the red clay cracked in summer and swallowed boots in the rain. There was no fence, no livestock, just a single white house that leaned slightly as if listening to the wind. A rusted windmill turned slow in the stillness, creaking like it remembered something. People passed it in silence, their wagons speeding up without meaning to. Everyone in town knew the Morton place, but no one could say much about the people who lived there. Only that they kept to themselves. Only that there were children once. Behind the house, beneath a scraggly cottonwood tree, were 8 flat stones pressed into the earth. No names, no carved dates, just river-washed slabs arranged in 2 perfect rows. The local preacher said they were burial markers. The story went that the Mortons had lost all their children to illness one bitter winter, back before the railroad reached the county. A fever, some said. Others whispered it was worse, but the official record said nothing at all. No death notices, no church bells, no funeral procession. Just those stones like teeth in the clay and the silence that came after. Still, every February, townsfolk noticed something strange. The post office received envelopes from the Morton household, birthday invitations written in neat cursive on stiff cream paper. Always the same names: Elias Jr., Henry, Nora, Caleb, Ruth, Mary, Thomas, and Grace. 8 names. The same every year. And every year the letters said they had turned another year older, turning 9, then 10, then 11. No one in town had ever seen the children alive, not once. But the letters continued, cheerful and polite, asking cousins and kin to come celebrate. No one ever went. Sometimes a visitor or traveling vendor would ask about the children. Mr. Morton would smile, nod, and gesture toward the house, saying, "They're inside reading, always learning. Discipline makes the mind strong." He wore suspenders and shined boots and kept his beard trimmed neat like someone who believed in order. His wife, Clara, stood quiet at the door, her apron always clean, her eyes always tired. If she spoke at all, it was only to say, "They're very obedient. We're proud of them." She said it like she meant it, but there was something in her voice that made people stop asking. The local children said the windmill turned even when there was no wind. They dared each other to run up to the porch and knock, but none ever did. One swore he saw a face watching from the attic window. Pale, unmoving, mouth open like it was trying to call out. But when his father asked what he saw, the boy lied and said he'd made it up. No one wanted to look too closely. No one wanted to believe something was wrong. The Morton farm was just one of those places that people accepted. Like the bad tooth in the back of your mouth that you learn to live with. Years passed, but the stones behind the house never shifted. No weeds grew between them. No animals ever dug at the earth. Some swore they saw fresh soil turned once a year, always in spring. But they didn't say it out loud. People whispered that the Morton family had endured enough, that there was no need to stir up old grief. And besides, Elias Morton paid his taxes, sent letters, and smiled when he tipped his hat in town. He seemed like a good man, the kind who did things right. And if he said his children were still growing, well, no one wanted to be the one to disagree. Every Wednesday morning, without fail, Elias Morton left his white house just after sunrise and made the 2-mile walk into town. He carried a small leather satchel tucked beneath his arm, the strap worn smooth where his hand always gripped it. He never took the buggy, never rode a horse. He said walking gave him time to think. The townspeople learned not to interrupt him. He didn't stop for coffee, didn't linger at the general store. He went straight to the post office, waited patiently in line, and handed the clerk a neat stack of sealed envelopes, always 8. Each one addressed in the same delicate, slanted handwriting. Each one bearing the same return name: Elias Morton, Red Clay Road. The postmaster once asked if all 8 children really wrote to their relatives every week. Elias smiled, the kind of smile that looked practiced, and said, "No, sir, that's my job. I speak for them until they're strong enough to speak for themselves." Then he tipped his hat and left. The letters were sent across the territory, to Kansas, Arkansas, Missouri, always to someone different, always with warm greetings. The envelopes never contained money, only updates, how Ruth had mastered her penmanship, how Thomas was asking questions about the stars, how Grace had taken to silence as a form of self-discipline and had gone 3 days without uttering a single word. He described the meals they ate, the books they read, the punishments they accepted when they strayed. Each letter was dated and signed in ink that never smudged. None of the recipients ever visited. Most didn't exist. Years later, it would come to light that several addresses were for buildings long abandoned. A shuttered chapel, a burned-down schoolhouse, even a graveyard caretaker's shed listed as a home. But at the time, no one checked. They just watched him walk in and out like clockwork every Wednesday. The children were never with him. Not once in over a decade did anyone see a single Morton child step foot in town. No child's hand tugged at his sleeve, no muddy shoes ran beside him. When someone asked, and they rarely did, he'd say, "They're inside learning to behave. I don't bring them out until they've earned the right to be seen." The way he said it sounded reasonable, almost admirable. Like a man proud of the order he'd built. But there was always something under the words, a weight that made people nod too quickly and walk away. The school board once sent a notice requiring Elias to enroll his children in formal education. He returned it unsigned, with a single sentence scrawled in the margin. Education begins with obedience. Obedience begins at home. After that, no one pressed him. The inspector assigned to follow up never made it past the front porch. Clara answered the door, her face pale, her voice soft. "We teach them everything they need. They're safe." She didn't invite him in. He didn't ask. Years later, when neighbors gathered to remember the strangest things, it was the letters they recalled most. The cheerfulness of them. The way Elias wrote about growth like it was measurable in inches of silence. He made discipline sound beautiful, like a gift. He described joy as stillness, curiosity as something that must be earned. And no matter how long the children had been buried, the letters never changed. They were always growing, always learning, always alive, at least on paper. In the spring of 1884, the U.S. Census sent a clerk named Marlene Wicklow to comb through the quiet corners of Oklahoma Territory. She was 23, newly appointed, with neat boots and a determination to do her job precisely. Townspeople liked her, polite but thorough, asking the right questions, not lingering where she wasn't wanted. She arrived at the Morton homestead on the second Tuesday of April, walking the 1.5 miles from the last mapped road. She carried her ledger pressed against her chest like a shield. She'd already recorded dozens of families, most large, many poor, all willing to speak, even if only for the record. The Morton property stood out immediately. Whitewashed and windowless on the upper floor, it looked too clean to be lived in. The front porch had no dust, no toys, no shoes. Just 2 chairs angled toward the east like someone had been waiting for a sunrise that never came. Elias opened the door before she could knock. He was already dressed in a clean shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows as if he knew she was coming. He greeted her with a calm voice and offered her a chair in the sitting room, which smelled faintly of wood polish and old wax. Marlene began her questioning. Standard things at first: number of residents, occupations, birthplaces, ages. He listed the children without hesitation. Elias Jr., age 13, Nora 11, Henry 10, Caleb 9, Ruth 8, Mary 7, Thomas 5, Grace 4. Each name spoken clearly, almost reverently. When asked where they were, he motioned toward the ceiling. Upstairs, studying. We keep to a strict routine. They'll come down when it's time. His tone made it clear there would be no interruption. She didn't argue. She noted each name and age, recorded his answers. Then came the schooling status. He paused before answering, then said, "Educated at home. Daily instruction, written assessments, no state oversight necessary." When she pressed gently, asking to see the children, if only to confirm for the record, he smiled faintly and said, "The state already has what it needs. Their names." She left with a sense of unease she couldn't quite name. Back at the township office, Marlene began compiling her ledgers, but something gnawed at her. She checked the previous census, from 1880. The names were there. Same order, same ages adjusted by 4 years, all still marked as living. She went further back. The 1875 special enumeration made when the territory was organizing. The same names, ages adjusted again. Elias Jr. always 13, Grace always the youngest, always alive. She dug through burial records, nothing official. But a local midwife had once noted infant death X3 Morton in the margins of her personal journal. No dates, no causes, just initials. She checked school rolls. No Mortons had ever attended. Church logs showed no baptisms. But the ledger kept recording them, year after year. The ink never faded. Same names, same clean cursive, tall loops, tight lines, and it was always the same hand. Not a child's, not a mother's. The same ink, the same pressure on the page. One night, curiosity took her to the edge of the Morton property. She stood at the split-rail fence and looked toward the tree behind the house. 8 stones, no names, no flowers. But someone had brushed away the dead leaves. The earth looked undisturbed but not forgotten. She stared at the house, at the window with the pale curtain, and wondered if anything inside could be called alive. When she turned in her report, she included the children exactly as given. It was easier that way. No one wanted to question a quiet man with neat handwriting and well-fed cattle. The Mortons were recorded, documented, preserved. 8 children, always the same. No death dates, just lines that stretched forward in time, like obedience written in permanent ink. In the fall of 1885, the town's only schoolhouse sat at the edge of a wheat field, 1 room wide with shuttered windows and a soot-stained chimney. Agnes Lyle had taught there for nearly 6 years, her hair pinned tight, her voice sharp but fair. She believed in discipline but never cruelty. She knew each child in the township by name, face, and temperament. Which ones cried when scolded? Which ones fought boredom with rebellion? Which ones drew quietly in the corners instead of reading? So when Elias Morton arrived one fog-damp morning, boots clean, collar straight, with a folded document in hand, she knew immediately something was off. He stepped through the door before the morning bell rang, standing still until the room fell silent. 20 children turned in their chairs to watch. Behind him stood a single boy, thin, pale. His eyes low to the floor, arms stiff at his sides. His boots were polished too. Agnes didn't recognize him. He didn't blink. "I'm here to enroll my 8, Elias said, holding out the paper. Names written in dark ink, ages neatly aligned, his own signature crisp at the bottom. "They are ready to begin formal education." Agnes scanned the list. Elias Jr., Nora, Henry, Caleb, Ruth, Mary, Thomas, Grace. She had seen those names before, in census logs, in whispered rumors, in birthday invitations that never led to parties. She looked to the boy beside him. "And the others?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "They are obedient at home. This one," he gestured to the boy, "has earned the right to be seen." The child didn't move. He didn't fidget or speak. His eyes remained on the floorboards. Agnes stepped closer and asked gently, "What's your name, dear?" The boy didn't answer. Elias did. Elias Jr., he knows better than to speak out of turn. We teach silence first. Agnes felt something tighten in her throat. She had heard of strict households. Some believed in firm hands and quiet children. But this was different. The boy didn't even seem to breathe. She asked to speak with Elias outside. Once alone on the porch, she told him that enrollment required the presence of each child. She needed to meet them, assess them, speak with them, see for herself that they were fit for the classroom. "They are," he said calmly, "but they are not yet worthy of being seen by others. They are working toward it. In our home, we graduate through obedience, not age." She asked again if she could meet them, just see them, even for a moment. "No," he said, "their work continues inside. They are progressing, slowly, properly, as they should." He left without another word, the boy following behind like a reflection. Agnes stood alone on the porch, the signed paper still in her hand. She turned it over. The back was blank, no ink smudge, no fold lines from a child's fingers. Just the hollow crispness of something never meant to be held. She reported the visit to the township board. They wrote a letter of inquiry, then never followed up. One official said the Mortons were a self-sufficient family and not to be troubled. Another claimed the children might be frail or disfigured and best kept away for their own protection. Agnes stopped pressing, but she never forgot the boy's eyes, dull, flat, emptied of any light a child should carry. Years later, when the truth clawed its way to the surface, Agnes would be asked if she remembered the day the Mortons tried to enroll their children. She would say yes, and that she remembered something else too. The boy who stood beside Elias Morton that day was not 13, as the paper claimed. He looked no older than 7, and he never cast a shadow when he walked out of the room. The rain came fast in the spring of 1886, thick as oil and twice as heavy. It swelled the creek beyond its banks and crept into the schoolhouse foundation, turning the packed dirt beneath it into mud. By morning, the back wall had buckled and the stovepipe leaned sideways, useless. Agnes Lyle stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, watching years of her effort sag into the earth. Before she could even arrange temporary shelter, Elias Morton appeared at her side, dry under a black umbrella, as if he had been waiting. "We have space," he said. "Clara insists." She hesitated, but the town was small. The inns were full with flood refugees, and her pride could not sleep on a stranger's barn floor. So she followed him, reluctantly, to the White House on Red Clay Road. Clara greeted her with silence and led her upstairs to a tidy guest room with crisp linens and a mirror too clean to trust. Agnes spent the evening tense but grateful, sipping weak tea, listening to the house creak like it had lungs. No children stirred, no footsteps above or laughter behind doors. Elias said they were in evening silence, a nightly ritual of stillness that lasted from supper to dawn. By the second day, something itched beneath the surface of the house. There were no toys, no school books, no signs of childhood at all. Only portraits. Stern-faced children in starched clothes, painted in oil and varnished to shine. But their eyes were wrong. Each pair seemed copied from the same face, unblinking, expressionless, duplicated like stamps. On the third evening, a storm struck hard and the lamps flickered out. Agnes reached for a candle from the mantel and her hand brushed the edge of the bookshelf. It shifted slightly, not by accident. The wood gave a soft click. Behind it, darkness. She held the candle forward, throat tight. The space revealed was narrow, low-ceilinged, and lined with cabinets. Inside each, propped upright in custom shelves, sat dolls. 8 of them. Each one crudely human, fashioned from cloth and porcelain, hair stitched with care. But their clothes were real, too real. Faded gingham dresses, tiny suspenders, dirt-stained boots. The name Ruth was embroidered onto a collar with uneven stitching. Henry was carved into a leather tag stitched to a vest. Agnes stepped back. The air smelled of wax and something sour. A small desk sat in the corner, child-sized, with a slate resting atop it, written faintly in chalk. I will obey, I will obey, I will obey. Beneath the slate, in a drawer barely ajar, were pages torn from a journal, drawings of small figures kneeling, mouths sewn shut, each labeled with a child's name. She didn't scream. She closed the bookshelf slowly and returned to her room, face pale, candle trembling. At dawn, she thanked Clara with a dry mouth, offered no excuse, and left before breakfast. She never told anyone what she saw. Not then. But after that night, she never allowed children to walk past the Morton house on their way to school. She had them circle the long way through the orchard instead, even when it rained, even when the road was flooded. She told them it was for safety, because the bridge near the Mortons had grown slippery. But the truth was simpler, heavier. She feared what waited behind those walls. Not ghosts, not dolls, but the idea that a father could make silence into a virtue and then dress it in his children's skin. In the autumn of 1887, a photographer arrived in town with a mule cart and a promise to capture every family for $2 apiece. His name was Luther Brandt, a man whose hands smelled of silver nitrate and who spoke with reverence about light. He'd worked his way west, town by town, leaving behind framed portraits that hung in parlors and courthouses, each one crisp and still as if time itself had paused to pose. The townspeople welcomed him eagerly. Mothers dressed their children in Sunday clothes. Fathers dusted off their boots. Even the mayor posed stiff-backed beside a borrowed fiddle. But the portrait everyone remembered came last. On the 4th morning, Luther knocked at the Morton house. It was Elias who answered, his voice polite but distant. He said the family would be honored. He requested a formal portrait. All of us, he said, even the children. Clara stood behind him, her hands folded, eyes unreadable. She nodded once, slow and tight. Luther set up the tripod on the lawn beneath the cottonwood tree, just beside the row of unmarked stones. The wind was calm, the light was clean. The family emerged in silence. Elias straight-backed, one hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder. She in her pressed dress, hair parted down the center. And behind them, 8 children. No chatter, no laughter. They moved like shadows with weight. All wore similar clothes, dark wool, starched collars, laced boots. Their faces were pale beneath the sun, their eyes slow to blink, their hands limp at their sides. Luther noticed they didn't fidget, not even the smallest ones. He directed them gently, asked for a little closer, told them not to smile as was custom for the era. He removed the lens cap, counted the seconds under his breath and captured the image. Then again, one with Clara holding a book, another with Elias standing alone, a child at either side. The children never spoke, never shifted. He developed the plates that evening in his cart behind the saloon. The first images appeared clean. The house, the tree, the shape of bodies framed against the sky. But the faces, the children's faces, every one of them, were blurred, not by movement, not by accident. Their outlines remained, but the features were gone, softened into smears of gray. Eyes stretched, noses vanished. Some mouths appeared as gaping smudges, others sealed like melted wax. Luther panicked, thinking the chemicals were bad, the emulsion too weak. He checked his kit. Everything was proper. He redid the batch. Same result. 8 children, 8 blanks where faces should be. The adults were perfect. Even the buttons on Elias's coat were clear. But the children's identities had been wiped like dust from a mirror, like someone had erased them from inside the lens. He returned the next morning unsure whether to explain or lie. Clara met him at the gate. She stepped outside alone, her shawl tight around her shoulders, and whispered, "You must burn them." Her voice trembled, but her face remained calm. "Please, don't show them to anyone, not even my husband." He asked her why. She only said, "They're not supposed to be seen like that." Luther left that day without taking another portrait. The townspeople never saw the prints. Only one copy was rumored to exist, a faint exposure, poorly fixed, tucked between pages of his journal. Years later, when a fire took his cart outside Tulsa, nothing survived but a scorched lens and a single warped glass plate. The image was cracked, fogged, but part of it remained. The Morton house, a man and a woman, and behind them a row of gray shapes with smeared, eyeless faces. Theories spread. Some blamed the light. Others said children often blinked during long exposures, but a few, mostly older women who remembered the way Clara stood that morning, swore it wasn't a mistake. They believed what was captured wasn't a flaw. It was a warning, a record of something that should have never stood still long enough to be photographed. Clara Morton never spoke much about her family, but people in town knew she had a sister in Tulsa. Her name was Marianne, and once, only once, she came to visit. It was late summer of 1888, a season thick with locusts and heat that made the woods sweat. Marianne arrived unannounced, stepping off the wagon with a single suitcase and the kind of tired that lives in the bones. She hadn't seen Clara in nearly a decade. They hugged, but it was the kind of hug you give at a funeral. Slow, stiff, and already full of regret. For 2 days, Marianne stayed in the upstairs guest room, the one that always smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. She ate in silence, observed the strict meal times, and nodded politely when Elias spoke of discipline and self-guided study. He talked about the children often, how they were reaching new thresholds of obedience, how stillness had become their second nature. But not once did Marianne see them. She asked Clara once in a hushed voice behind the parlor door, "Where are they?" Clara only said, "They're near, but we don't let them break the silence during spiritual growth." On the third night, a hot wind came up through the valley and rattled the eaves. Marianne went to the porch for air. What she saw there was never described in full. The next morning, she was gone. No goodbye, no breakfast, no letter. Her suitcase was missing and the gate out front hung open. Clara told neighbors her sister had remembered urgent business back home, but her eyes were swollen and her hands trembled when she poured tea. It would be decades before anyone understood what Marianne had seen. In 1931, a storm with winds strong enough to snap fence posts came roaring through Red Clay Road. The old Morton house, abandoned by then rotting into the earth, shuddered in the gusts. The porch roof gave way and the windmill cracked from its base. The next morning, a surveyor sent to assess damage found something tangled in the debris. A wind chime, long buried in cobwebs, had fallen from where it had once been nailed to the underside of the porch beam. But it wasn't made of metal or glass, it was made of teeth. Dozens of them. Tiny, milk-white, threaded together on brittle strings of braided hair. Each strand held 6 to 8 teeth spaced carefully, knotted at intervals. And on every single tooth, no matter how small, was a carved letter. Not etched but whittled, each groove careful and deliberate. E for Elias, N for Nora, H for Henry, C for Caleb, R for Ruth, M for Mary, T for Thomas, G for Grace. There were exactly 64 teeth. Later examination confirmed they were all human, all from children no older than 10. Some had small blood-dark stains at the roots, suggesting they were not lost naturally. The hair, once tested, belonged to at least 3 different individuals, each sample too short and fine to match an adult. No explanation was ever given. The town sheriff, new to the territory, unaware of the whispers, sealed the evidence away and called it a folk object of questionable origin. But those who remembered Marianne's visit, the way she fled without a word, began to speak of that chime differently. It hadn't been an ornament. It had been a warning, strung from silence. Elias Morton had spoken often of discipline, of obedience, of growth through pain. But no one had realized he'd taken his children's voices one by one and hung their screams in the breeze. Each note ringing out as a name carved into ivory that never got a chance to fall out on its own. By the winter of 1888, the Morton house had turned into something the townsfolk no longer mentioned aloud. It sat quiet by day, shuddering in wind. The porch now half collapsed, the paint graying into the red clay beneath it. But at night it changed. It began with soft sounds, barely noticed at first. A hum, then the low trace of melody. People said it might be the wind threading through broken window panes or the creak of timber as the temperature dropped. But the notes came too steady, too purposeful. A pattern began to form. Songs, lullabies, hummed in perfect pitch, layered atop one another like a choir learning to whisper. Neighbors heard it just after midnight. Always after midnight. All through the night. Then, "Go to sleep, little baby." Then one no one recognized, something slow and low with no real words, just syllables. The kind of tune a mother might sing if she believed stillness was the only form of love. People started sleeping with their windows shut, though no one dared say why. They told themselves it was the cold, or the coyotes, or the river mist that crept too close. But they knew. Deep down, they knew. Old Miss Avery, who lived 3 fields down, was the first to speak aloud what others feared. She said the singing didn't stop when morning came. It just changed. "It folds into the walls," she said. "The house breathes it, like lungs filled with prayer." Her sons told her to stop talking nonsense. But one of them, the younger boy, began waking in the middle of the night, pale and drenched, saying he dreamed of rows of children kneeling on floorboards, mouths sewn shut, humming through broken teeth. Then came the story of Walter Fry, the milk delivery boy. 14, with chapped knuckles and a stammer, he claimed to have seen something no one else had. It was just before dawn when he passed the Morton house, light frost slicking the grass. He said he glanced up toward the attic window and saw them. 8 children, shoulder to shoulder, standing still behind the glass. Their faces were pale, identical. Their mouths were open, wide and round, but silent. Their eyes were empty as if painted on, not blinking, not focused, just open, waiting. He said the window had frost on the inside, and yet no breath fogged the pane. And then, without moving, the children began to hum. But it wasn't sound. It was something Walter felt, like a vibration in his spine. He dropped the milk pail and ran until his lungs burned. When asked what he saw later, he wept. "They weren't alive," he kept saying. "But they weren't dead either. They were still being made." Others began hearing things too. Not just lullabies, but small knocks in the walls. The creak of footsteps above. The scrape of chairs moving without cause. A mail carrier left a parcel at the Morton gate and claimed he heard someone whisper his name, though no one stood near. A parson traveling through refused Elias's invitation to supper, citing spiritual heaviness in the air, a term he'd only used once before after reading last rites to a mother who'd smothered her children during a snowstorm. The Mortons, for their part, denied nothing. They never addressed it. Clara simply said, "The children are progressing." Elias said, "Their voices are being shaped." No one pressed further. Years later, when the house was finally abandoned, workers sealed the attic window with boards. But some swear that when the wind is just right and the trees stand still, a soft hum still seeps through the gaps. A chorus with no breath behind it, singing songs no child should ever have to learn. The Morton property had always carried an unspoken rule. You didn't look too long and you didn't ask too much. But in the fall of 1887, something shifted. It began one morning when the fog refused to lift. The cottonwood tree behind the house, the one that loomed over the 8 child-sized stones, was barely visible through the mist. But when the sun finally burned through by noon, something new stood beside them. A 9th stone, fresh, upright, still wet with soil, taller than the others, smoother. Unlike the round river-washed markers for the children, this one had been carved. Not with a name, not with dates, just a single shape, an eye. No one saw who placed it. The ground beneath it was clean, as if no spade had touched it. The grass around it was flattened, but no prints remained. Only the stone, centered precisely in the row, as if it had always belonged. By dusk, word spread. A local farmhand passing by on horseback said he spotted Elias that evening standing motionless at the foot of the grave. His hands were behind his back and he appeared to be speaking, not aloud but in a slow rhythm like a man reciting something only he could hear. The farmhand didn't stop to ask. No one did. But the gossip that week outpaced the river's current. The next Sunday, Clara Morton was gone. Her absence wasn't loud. No one heard a scream. There was no wagon trail leading out, no trunk packed on the porch. But she no longer answered the door, no longer appeared at market. The woman who had always stood quietly behind Elias, whose fingers trembled when she poured tea, whose voice cracked when she spoke of her children's progress, had simply vanished. When someone asked Elias where his wife had gone, he said without hesitation, "She returned to her sister. She needed rest." But there was no letter, no telegram, and no one in Tulsa ever confirmed her arrival. Agnes Lyle, who knew Clara better than most, said she doubted Clara left by choice. She was tired, Agnes said softly, but not the kind of tired that walks away, the kind that breaks. A week after Clara disappeared, the eye carved into the 9th stone was painted, not brightly, just a faint black ring, like soot rubbed into the grooves, and beneath it a small dash appeared like a tear. Some believed it was a memorial. Others believed it was a warning. Behind closed doors, neighbors whispered that Clara had always watched too closely. That maybe she'd begun to ask questions, maybe she had opened the wrong door. Maybe she had tried to take something, or someone with her, a child too broken to leave, a journal too damning to share, or perhaps she had simply begun to see her husband too clearly for what he really was. Not a father, not a teacher, but a craftsman of silence, perfecting his work one child at a time. When the spring thaw came the next year, the grass over the 9th grave bloomed unnaturally fast, thick and wild, curling like fingers over the stone. Children who wandered too close swore they heard whispering from the roots. They said it didn't sound angry, it sounded sad. The other 8 stones remained untouched, cold and mute, but the 9th one seemed to breathe, and no one ever asked Elias about his wife again. In early 1889, a small fire broke out in the abandoned parlor of the Morton house. It started just before dawn, likely from the old stove, long left rusting but somehow still connected to the flue. By the time neighbors arrived with pails, the flames had already collapsed the hearth and blackened half the wall. It wasn't a full burn, not enough to destroy the structure. Just a flash of smoke and heat, as if the house itself had finally exhaled. Afterward, the fire marshal searched the damage and found something buried behind the soot-choked bricks. Inside the chimney flue, stuffed between crumbling mortar and scorched creosote, were bundles of folded paper. Dry, brittle, and packed tight like insulation. Dozens of pages sealed in waxy layers of soot, singed at the edges but preserved within. No one had expected to find anything. Most assumed the Mortons left behind little more than dust and rot. But what was recovered told a different story. A meticulous one, a horrifying one. The pages were not letters. They weren't diaries. They were diagrams. Each sheet bore hand-drawn silhouettes of children rendered in black ink with the care of a surgeon. Some were labeled by name: Elias Jr., Nora, Ruth, others by number. Each child's shape was measured: height, shoulder width, the curvature of spine, position of chin. Arrows marked the posture line and noted deviations in tilt or symmetry. But the focus wasn't growth, it was correction. Across many of the figures, red lines had been inked over shoulders, knees, and hips, indicating defiance lean or disobedient slouch. Others included faint pencil sketches of tools, metal braces that curved around necks, harnesses with crank-tightened straps across the ribs, wires designed to pull elbows back until the spine arched straight. One note beside a drawing of a small torso read, "Applied nightly. Observe for silence upon waking." Near the bottom of the pile were scoring sheets. Columns of numbers beside names. Each entry marked obedience level followed by a percentage. There were entries like whispered without permission, 3, and broke gaze during instruction, 5. The handwriting remained steady across the pages, no matter the date. Same penmanship, same pressure. It was Elias's hand. Some pages included lists of punishments, notations beside the words calm deprivation, light fasting, and restraint therapy. These were not punishments in the traditional sense. They were experiments, each marked with reactions. Cried 3 minutes. Resumed silence. Reapplied brace. Another note stated vocal protest minimal. Wrist spurs adjusted accordingly. One page stood out above the rest. A silhouette of a child, possibly a girl, narrow frame, sloped shoulders, drawn from the back with a harness diagram sketched over the spine. Across her head was a thin oval marked vocal dampener. A note beneath it read, "Prevents disruptive singing. Rhythm correction required." In the margins, Clara's name had been written and crossed out, then rewritten, then crossed out again. It was unclear how long the papers had been there, how many years they'd sat above the hearth absorbing heat from a fire they didn't start. Some believed they were hidden just before Elias died. Others thought Clara had placed them there in a final act of quiet rebellion. But whoever did it must have known. Must have realized no one would believe words alone. The diagrams were not fantasies. They were plans, instructions, evidence. The town archivist sealed the documents in a flat file, but copies were made, whispered over, studied. And those who looked too long at the drawings, who saw the tiny metal hooks around shoulder blades or the wire-bound jaw sketches labeled final stage, found themselves unable to sleep. Because the worst part wasn't what Elias had done. The worst part was the care he took, the neatness, the method, the belief that you could shape obedience, not by teaching but by bending the body until the soul caved inward. Until silence was the only thing left that could be called a voice. It wasn't mercy that brought the authorities to the Morton house in 1892. It was paperwork. A clerical review of township records revealed something that couldn't be ignored any longer. 8 children listed as living year after year without school attendance, church confirmation, or medical record. Their names were still logged, still drawn forward like shadows into a future they could never reach. Too many pages had passed without revision, and too many people had whispered for too long. The sheriff, new to the region and unburdened by the town's generational silence, ordered an inspection. By then, the house was half swallowed by weeds. The front porch sagged and the windmill had snapped in two, its blades rusted in place. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but when the lawmen arrived, the front door was unlocked. There was no sign of forced entry. The interior smelled of iron and mildew. On the hearth sat a cracked teacup, still holding a ring of dried liquid. Upstairs, the rooms were stripped bare. No beds, no toys, no clothes, only a series of nails in the walls spaced evenly where frames once hung. Dust marked the outlines of where portraits had been removed. The silence was thick and wrong. They almost missed the entrance to the basement. It was hidden behind a shelving unit in the pantry, one that slid away with unnatural ease. The stairs beneath were steep and narrow, carved straight into the earth. The smell changed as they descended, antiseptic, mold, and something sour beneath it. The first chamber was small, just tall enough to stand in. It held 6 desks, child-sized, each one bolted to the floor. On the writing surface of each was a slate, and on each slate, the same sentence repeated over and over: I will obey, I will obey, I will obey. The handwriting varied, jagged, looping, sometimes childlike, sometimes rigid with panic. Beside each desk was a metal pipe, fixed to the wall and ending in a clamp. Feeding tubes. Most were empty, but 2 still dripped faintly. The warmth of the liquid inside made the sheriff drop his lantern. One tube was connected to a long hose, stained and frayed, coiled like a sleeping snake beneath the desk. A journal lay open nearby, its cover marked with the initials CM. The inside was worse. Tally marks covered the pages, symbols for hours in silence, deductions for twitching, flinching, blinking out of rhythm. No child's name appeared in full, only letters and scores. The second room was worse. It was darker, quieter. Its walls had been padded with layers of stitched cloth. Old garments, maybe, nailed over each other to muffle sound. There were no desks here, just one small figure kneeling in the center, bound at the wrists, hands tied to a slate board propped against the wall. The board read, "Do not speak until spoken through." The child was thin, sunken-eyed, knees bruised from the stone floor. The rope cuts at the wrists were fresh. The child was breathing. When they moved to untie him, he didn't react, didn't flinch. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He mouthed something, over and over, but the words were lost. One officer tried to lift him, but the boy's legs refused to straighten. He had been kneeling too long. His body had shaped itself to obedience. In the corner of the room sat a small chair and a notebook. The final page was dated just a week prior. It read, Unit G reached level 5. Vocal resistance removed, motion minimized, meal compliance 98%, behavioral collapse imminent, recommend burial or replacement. The sheriff would later report that the child was transported to the local infirmary and placed under care. But no further records of the boy exist. His name was never entered into any hospital registry. No one saw him again. The children had never been dead. They had been erased in a slower, more deliberate way, not through death, but through confinement so absolute it became invisible. Elias hadn't buried their bodies, he had buried their wills. Each slate board, each feeding tube, each scoring sheet. Tools not of education but of extinction, the kind that left the heart beating but hollow. The kind that made a child kneel for years waiting for permission to breathe. The arrest of Elias Morton made headlines across the territory, though none dared print the full extent of what was found beneath his home. The official charges were severe: unlawful confinement, extreme child neglect, endangerment, and suspected homicide. But what the public wanted was simpler. They wanted a word for evil. They wanted someone to name what he had done. And they wanted the court to confirm what they feared, that for over a decade, 8 children had suffered in silence, and that a father had orchestrated their erasure with ink, rope, and ritual. The trial was set for October of 1892 in the county seat, a courthouse that had never held more than a land dispute or a petty theft. Spectators filled the benches, their faces pale, their hands tight in their laps. Reporters waited outside for updates. Yet inside the courtroom, nothing followed the expected path. The prosecution entered with bundles of records, slates with repetitive phrases, anatomical diagrams from the chimney, feeding tubes recovered from the basement. But as the case unfolded, pieces began to fall apart. Evidence vanished. Journals submitted as proof disappeared overnight in a fire at the evidence storage barn. The sheriff's copy had been left at home that evening, an oversight he would never explain. Clara Morton's name, written dozens of times across entries, could no longer be substantiated. Her body had never been found. Without her, half the prosecution's case, suggesting shared knowledge and systematic abuse, crumbled. The child who had been found alive, Nurnum, a boy thought to be Elias Jr., was transferred under protective custody to a regional hospital for trauma victims. But in the week before the trial, he vanished. No record of departure, no witness. The attending nurse, when questioned, simply said, "His bed was made when I returned, but I never made it." No one saw him leave. No official form was filed. He was gone. Some said Elias had help from outside, that others shared his beliefs. Others claimed the boy had never truly recovered, that what remained of him had simply slipped away, silent and obedient until the end. Elias himself remained impassive through each hearing. He sat upright, hands folded in his lap, and answered questions only when pressed. When asked why the children were hidden, he said they were being prepared. When asked about the braces, the confinement, the scoring sheets, he replied, "Obedience is not cruelty. It is the only way to remove the self." A reporter later wrote that Elias spoke of the children not as sons and daughters, but as vessels, incomplete things to be carved, corrected, and stilled. His defense team argued diminished capacity. They claimed religious delusion, citing notebooks filled with fragmented scriptures rewritten in Elias's hand, warped to justify what he called refinements. But the judge remained unconvinced. A verdict seemed imminent. Then, before closing arguments, Elias collapsed in his holding cell. An autopsy revealed a cerebral hemorrhage, likely from prolonged, untreated hypertension. Some believed it was natural. Others believed it was timed, that he chose his moment just as he had controlled every moment before it. He left behind no final statement, no confession. No list of names, only silence. Without him, the trial ended unresolved. No one was convicted. No bodies were ever exhumed. The graves behind the Morton house were never dug up, not legally. The courts closed the case in early 1893, citing lack of prosecutable evidence. The record simply noted, "Deceased, charges vacated." But the townspeople knew. They always had, in their bones, in the way they walked faster past the house, in the way they changed the subject when children asked about the wind chimes. They knew that evil doesn't always confess. It doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it wears a clean shirt, smiles politely in court, and dies before anyone can speak the truth aloud. By the turn of the century, the Morton house had collapsed inward. Vines choked the foundation, the chimney lay split open like a cracked bone, and rain pooled where the kitchen once stood. Children walked on the other side of the road when passing. No one went near after sunset. The land was never sold. No one wanted it. But in state archives, far from the red clay and cottonwoods, something from the house remained. A single page, brittle and yellowed, pulled from the ashes by a junior court clerk who hadn't known better than to look. It came from the ledger. The same ledger Elias Morton had used to document his children's growth. Not in inches or age, but in behavior. The surviving page had been preserved only by accident. It had slipped between floorboards during evidence review, discovered years later during building renovations. It was logged and filed as anonymous, yet its handwriting matched the chimney diagrams, the slate messages, the scoring tables. It was unmistakably his. The page began plainly, Progress Report, Cycle 9. But what followed was not a list of lessons or meals or chores. It was a monologue, a philosophy, a doctrine masked in neat cursive. Elias had written, Obedience continues after breath. The body may expire, but the lesson remains. Behavior must outlive blood. That is the measure of success. He detailed how he had recalibrated expectations, removed the distractions of affection, redefined failure not as rebellion but as noise, the mere presence of self. The goal, he wrote, was uninterrupted stillness. He believed that a child could be reduced to pure response, unclouded by emotion or thought. That silence, when perfected, would leave behind something better than a soul. A vessel capable of carrying instruction beyond death. At the bottom of the page, centered beneath his signature, he had written, We are what we're written to be. When the page surfaced in 1902 during a legislative review on state education funding, it sparked quiet panic. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Lawmakers, most of whom had never heard of Elias Morton, read it in a sterile room under gaslight. Some scoffed, called it the ravings of a lunatic. But one woman on the board, a former school teacher from a nearby township, grew pale. She recognized the names. She had once received birthday invitations from those children. She said nothing at the time, but she brought the page to the superintendent's desk and whispered, This cannot happen again. The result, passed in early 1903, was Oklahoma's first home education oversight law. It required that all children taught outside public schools be registered with full documentation, verified progress, and yearly in-person assessments. Though the statute bore no name, educators across the region began calling it the Morton Clause. It was meant to prevent children from vanishing beneath ledgers and silence, to ensure that names in ink were tied to voices, to eyes, to breath. The state never formally linked the law to the Morton case. Official records remained vague, blurred by lost documents, vanished children, and a man who died before justice could be named. But the archivists knew, the families knew, and the final page remained locked in a glass case. One line circled in red, Obedience continues after breath. Visitors to the archive sometimes asked why such a line was preserved. A clerk once replied, Because if we forget how he thought, we'll forget what he did. And if we forget what he did, someone else might write their own ledger, neat and quiet with empty boxes waiting to be filled. The Morton house no longer stands. The white paint that once glared against the red clay has peeled into dust. The windmill, long rusted and broken, was swallowed by weeds. The stones behind the house, once 8, then 9, have sunk unevenly into the soil, their surfaces bare, their stories untold. No names were ever carved, no candles left behind, no flowers, just a crooked fence around a patch of earth too quiet for comfort. Time moved on. The town grew. New houses rose where fields once stretched, and children walked to school along new paved roads, never knowing the path once curved around a house where children were taught never to speak. The story faded as stories do. Elias Morton became little more than a cautionary footnote, his crimes never fully proven, his methods never fully understood. The child who survived, the boy who had once knelt for years in the dark, vanished into the cracks of a system not built to see him. But the echoes remain, in archived ledgers and whispered memories, in the law that quietly changed without naming the reason, in teachers who began insisting on seeing every child's eyes, hearing their voices, checking for bruises that discipline should never leave, because this wasn't a story about a man who hated. Elias did not scream or strike in rage. His evil was colder, more dangerous. He believed he was right, that love meant reshaping, that silence was safety, that obedience was a gift, and children were unfinished things waiting to be carved. He didn't kill them to be rid of them. He buried them in stillness to make them better. That is the horror that lingers, not in what was found beneath the house, but in what was written, methodically, lovingly, with ink and numbers and diagrams that turned a father into a craftsman of quiet. He measured disobedience in millimeters. He corrected curiosity with harnesses. And when his children stopped speaking, he called it peace. We are taught to fear monsters that rage, but Elias Morton never raised his voice. He smiled. He wrote letters. He kept records so precise that even the state believed his children were alive long after they were gone. Because the truth is, sometimes death isn't the end of suffering. Sometimes the worst kind of cruelty is the one that continues after breath. In ledgers, in laws, in silence passed down through generations. How many other names still live on paper but not in person? How many ledgers hide pain beneath polite words? How many parents believe obedience is love? And how many children are kneeling somewhere right now waiting to be unbound? This was the story of the Morton family, but it was never just about them. What do you think? Could this happen again?